The Mistake That Changed the War. The Flight of Oberleutnant Armin Faber. June 23, 1942. 7,000 feet above the Bristol Channel. The late afternoon sun glared through the canopy of Oberleutnant Armin Faber's FW-190A3, the Luftwaffe's newest and deadliest fighter. The air shimmered gold across the sea. Below him, the water sparkled like a mirror, deceptively calm, reflecting both the sky and the arrogance that came with being one of the Luftwaffe's elite. For months, the FW-190 had been the terror of the Western Front. It was faster, stronger, and more agile than any British aircraft. Pilots of the RAF Spitfire Mark V had come to dread the distinct whine of its radial BMW 801 engine, a sound that often meant their fight was already lost. Faber had flown dozens of missions from Brest, dueling British Spitfires across the Channel. The FW-190 was his pride, a machine that could outroll and outclimb anything the Allies had. That morning, he had led his Staffel on an escort for a bomber raid over Devon. The flight had gone smoothly. Too smoothly. Now, as his squadron turned back toward France, Faber broke formation, scanning for stragglers. A few miles behind, a lone Spitfire flashed silver in the sunlight. He banked sharply, throttling forward, intent on one last kill before dinner. Eine letzte Trophäe, he muttered. One last trophy. The Spitfire dove for the clouds, and Faber followed, the altimeter spinning down. The 190's wide wings bit into the mist, the artificial horizon tilted. The sea came up fast, then vanished. When Faber burst through the bottom of the cloud bank, he was no longer sure which direction he faced. For a few seconds, the world was chaos, sky and water merging into one gray void. His compass spun uselessly, its card trembling from vibration. In his headset, the radio crackled with voices. His Staffel calling for formation, command issuing bearings. He ignored them. He trusted his instincts. He pulled north, or what he thought was north, and leveled off. Below him, the coastline emerged through the haze. Rugged cliffs, green fields, and a faint line of airfield hangars. Relief washed over him. Home. Brittany, he assumed. He'd overshot, perhaps drifted east, but the terrain looked familiar enough. He throttled back, circled once, and saw what he expected, the welcoming sprawl of what he thought was a Luftwaffe base. The landing strip stretched clean and inviting. A control tower stood to one side. A few figures moved on the ground, waving. Faber dropped his gear and flaps. The FW-190 descended with a confident hum. He had no reason to question the cheers coming from the runway. The wheels kissed tarmac. Dust kicked up behind the tailwheel as he rolled to a stop. Then, he saw the Spitfires. Not wrecks, not trophies, but lined up in neat, polished rows. Their canopies gleamed in the sun. Their markings were bright red, white, and blue, the unmistakable roundels of the Royal Air Force. The figures on the ground were not Luftwaffe mechanics. They were British airmen, staring at him open-mouthed, frozen in disbelief. For several seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling BMW engine. Faber's stomach dropped. The realization hit him with physical force. He wasn't in France. He wasn't even close. He had just landed, intact and unharmed, in Wales. at RAF Pembry. A young RAF sergeant named Geoffrey Quill was the first to react. He sprinted from the control tower, shouting for the guards. The air raid siren wailed once, confused and uncertain, before cutting off. Faber raised his hands, trembling. He tried to open the canopy, but before he could climb out, an armed corporal had already leapt onto the wing, revolver drawn. Out. Now. Faber obeyed, climbing down slowly, boots hitting British soil for the first time, as a prisoner, not a conqueror. Behind him, his Focke-Wulf 190 sat gleaming in the afternoon light, its wings unbroken, its fuselage intact, its guns still loaded. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had captured Germany's most secret weapon in perfect condition. What had been a navigational error born of confusion and arrogance would become one of the most extraordinary intelligence windfalls of the entire war. At that moment, Heinz Faber had no idea that his mistake would not only change his life, it would change the course of aerial combat over Europe.
The Eagle lands in Wales, the day the RAF got its miracle. RAF Pembry, Wales, June 23, 1942. The base was quiet when the alarm stopped. A handful of mechanics, clerks, and ground crew stood dumbstruck at the edge of the runway. They had just watched the enemy's most feared fighter, the legendary Focke-Wulf 190, roll to a halt in the middle of their own airfield, its black crosses gleaming under the British sun. Sergeant Geoffrey Quill, barely in his 20s, stood with his revolver drawn, pointing it at the man who had just climbed out. The German officer, young, confident, and still in full flight gear, raised his hand slowly. His flying jacket bore the eagle and swastika of the Luftwaffe. His boots were dusted with channel sand. He looked stunned, like a man waking from a dream. "Name?" Quill demanded. "Oberleutnant Armin Faber, Jagdgeschwader 5. His voice was calm, even proud. Faber glanced around, confusion flickering behind his composure. The Spitfires parked nearby, their roundels bright and alien, told him everything he needed to know. He muttered something in German, half to himself. Mein Gott, England. Within minutes, RAF personnel swarmed the field. Officers arrived from the control tower, pistols drawn but faces awestruck. The base commander, Group Captain Finley Boyd, demanded confirmation, who this man was, where he'd come from, and whether his plane was booby-trapped. The mechanics circled the aircraft like archaeologists unearthing treasure. For months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been an obsession, a ghost in the sky, killing British pilots faster than anyone could explain. And now, one sat before them. Perfect, untouched. By 1800 hours, the news had already reached RAF Fighter Command headquarters in London. A secure transmission crackled over the line. German Focke-Wulf fighter landed intact at Pembry. Pilot captured unharmed. Aircraft serviceable. Request technical team immediately. The reply came almost instantly. Protect aircraft at all costs. Send guards. No photographs until authorized. Within 24 hours, a small convoy of trucks, intelligence officers, and aviation engineers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough arrived under heavy escort. The Focke-Wulf was disassembled just enough to fit through the narrow country roads and transported in secrecy to Boscombe Down, Britain's testing center for captured aircraft. The code name was simple: Air Min 15, Enemy Aircraft Evaluation. For the first time since 1941, British engineers could finally see what they were fighting, not in sketches, not in grainy reconnaissance photos, but in steel and rivets.
At Boscombe Down, the 190 was reassembled with surgical precision. Every part, from the BMW 801 radial engine to the MG 151 cannons, was catalogued, photographed, and measured. The first man chosen to fly it was a name already whispered with reverence in aviation circles, Captain Eric Winkle Brown. A Royal Navy test pilot, barely 30 years old, Brown was known for his calm under pressure and his fluency in German, a rare combination that made him ideal for what would become one of the most important flights of the war. When he first walked into the hangar, he stopped dead. The Focke-Wulf sat under a tarp, its mottled gray camouflage streaked with the grime of combat, the black iron crosses still sharp against its flanks. Brown would later write, "She was beautiful, squat, muscular, purposeful, the sort of aircraft that didn't so much look fast as inevitable." Before taking off, Brown and his team studied every inch of the fighter. The differences between it and the Spitfire Mark V were immediately clear. The cockpit was spacious, almost luxurious compared to the cramped Spitfire. Controls were smooth, hydraulics responsive, and the throttle quadrant built for brutal precision. The radial engine, cooled by a complex system of cowl flaps, gave the 190 immense durability at low altitude, something British pilots could never match. But the real revelation came when Brown took her into the air. July 3, 1942, Boscombe Down, Wiltshire. The Focke-Wulf roared down the runway and leapt skyward with terrifying ease. Brown described the takeoff as effortless, the torque pulling hard but manageable. At 10,000 feet, he pushed the throttle open and felt it, the power, the authority. The roll rate was the finest of any aircraft in existence, Brown wrote later. From upright to inverted in less than 2 seconds, no Allied fighter could even come close. He turned, dove, and pulled up again, testing the limits. The aircraft responded like a living thing. It could outroll every Spitfire. It could outdive every Hurricane. And at low altitudes, it was faster than anything Britain had. The realization hit hard. This was why they were dying. When Brown landed, a small crowd of engineers and officers waited anxiously. He climbed down, pulled off his helmet, and said simply, "Now we know why we're losing." But he wasn't finished, because inside that cockpit, that miracle of German engineering, he had also felt something else. A weakness, subtle but unmistakable. He would spend the next week testing, pushing, and prodding the 19 until he found it, a single flaw buried in perfection. And when he did, the war in the air would begin to turn. Breaking the Wolf, Captain Eric Brown's discovery. Boscombe Down, July 1942. The morning air shimmered over the runway as Captain Eric Winkle Brown strapped himself back into the cockpit of the FW-190. The engine still smelled faintly of burnt oil and German fuel, and the cockpit labels, all in neat Gothic script, were reminders that he was sitting in the enemy's finest creation. He wasn't there to admire it this time. He was there to break it. The test plan was brutal and methodical. Brown's notes, written in tiny, careful handwriting, listed the maneuvers: climb rate, sustained roll, stall recovery, compressibility dive, and energy retention curves. At 8:03 a.m., the BMW 801 engine coughed once, then settled into a throaty, confident growl. Brown taxied to the threshold, released the brakes, and the fighter surged forward like a coiled spring unleashed. The Focke-Wulf leapt off the ground long before the end of the runway, climbing at a rate that made Brown whistle through his teeth. "She's a brute," he murmured into the recorder strapped to his chest. 10,000 feet. He began with level flight handling. Smooth, balanced, the control harmony was almost musical, a perfect blend of power and precision. 15,000 feet. He tested the roll. Full deflection. Bang bang. The aircraft snapped upright to inverted in under 2 seconds. No wonder our boys couldn't turn with her, he thought. 20,000 feet. He climbed and dove, measuring airspeed gain. The acceleration was savage, the radial engine pouring torque into the propeller like an unleashed turbine. Every test confirmed the same thing. The FW-190 wasn't just fast, it was stable at speed. Where the Spitfire began to shudder and flex in high-speed dives, the German machine cut through the air like it owned it. When he landed, the engineers and intelligence officers crowded around. "Well," asked Wing Commander Watson, notebook in hand. Brown wiped the sweat from his forehead and said, "It's magnificent, and it's killing us because it deserves to." He paused, eyes narrowing. "But I think I've found her soft spot." Over the next several days, Brown pushed the aircraft harder. He climbed higher, flew longer, and forced the 190 into regimes it was never meant to endure. The weakness began to reveal itself, not in the engine or the guns, but in the controls. At low altitude, the FW-190 handled like a sports car, but at high altitude, where the thin air resisted less, its ailerons, the same ones that gave it its legendary roll rate, became stiff, heavy, and slow. He felt it on his fourth test flight at 24,000 feet when he tried to roll left at high speed. The stick fought back, reluctant. The roll was sluggish, lazy. In combat, that would be death. He jotted a note on his kneeboard. Control stiffness greater than 20,000 feet. Pilot cannot sustain energy fight above Spitfire ceiling. It was a small detail, but in the calculus of war, it was gold. When Brown presented his findings to Fighter Command, the room was silent. Generals, engineers, and squadron leaders leaned over the chart where he'd drawn the comparative performance lines between the Spitfire Mark V and the FW-190. Up to 15,000 feet, the German fighter outclassed the Spitfire in every way: speed, climb, roll rate, and firepower. But above 20,000, the lines crossed. The Spitfire's Merlin engine kept breathing freely. Its elliptical wings held their lift. The Focke-Wulf began to suffocate. Its controls locked. Its performance plateaued. Brown tapped the graph with his pencil. "Gentlemen, here is your battlefield. Don't fight them down here." He pointed to the lower altitudes shaded red. "Drag them up here, into the cold, thin air. Make them fight where they can't move." The change was immediate. Within weeks, RAF Fighter Command issued new tactical orders. Do not engage FW-190 below 20,000 feet unless with surprise advantage. Force engagement at altitude. The directive spread across every squadron in southern England. Pilots who had been dying in droves now had a strategy. The next time Spitfires met FW-190s over Dieppe, the outcome was very different. On August 19, 1942, during the Dieppe raid, the Luftwaffe arrived confident, expecting another massacre. Instead, Spitfire's Mark IXs climbed to 25,000 feet and lured the German fighters higher. When the 90s tried to roll or bank, their control surfaces froze. Their advantage vanished. In less than 10 minutes, 5 FW-190s went down, none of them escaping above cloud. For the first time in months, the RAF was winning again. Meanwhile, Brown's report was sent across the Atlantic to the U.S. Army Air Forces, where American engineers studying the P-47 Thunderbolt in the upcoming P-51 Mustang immediately took note. They redesigned flight training around it. If you can't outrun them, outthink them. Climb, drag, and strike where they can't follow. The Faber incident, as it was now known, became one of the greatest intelligence coups of the war. Not because of sabotage, not because of espionage, but because one confident German pilot had taken a wrong turn home. When Faber himself was interrogated, he reportedly said very little. He asked for a cigarette, then muttered, "I thought I was landing in France." His interrogator, amused, replied, "You were close. Wrong side of the channel, that's all." Faber's mistake had done what no spy could. It handed the Allies the Luftwaffe's crown jewel intact. Captain Eric Brown, for his part, would go on to fly over 487 different aircraft types, more than any pilot in history. But years later, when asked which single flight had mattered most, he didn't hesitate. "The day I flew the Focke-Wulf," he said, "because that was the day we stopped fearing it." And so, the war's deadliest fighter, the scourge of the Channel skies, was undone not by battle, but by a compass arrow, a patch of cloud, and one man's misplaced confidence. From that mistake came the intelligence that shaped Allied air tactics for the rest of the war, saving hundreds of pilots who might otherwise have never made it home. One flight, one landing, and a lesson carved in history. Even the perfect weapon can be undone by human error and a little luck.